So how do you actually take height in fights? Well, it's not as complicated as you may think. You don't have to be super cracked mechanically, you don't have to know all of the Faze Sway retakes. This really isn't something that you actually need to do in game. Now, if you're in creative, you have infinite materials and there's no fall damage, you can definitely do something like all these mad Faze Sway retakes, as they're still beneficial to learn because you can definitely increase your mechanical skill this way and have a surplus of mechanical skill for if you ever need it. There are a large amount of really successful competitive players who have this basis in this really high level of mechanics, such as Stretch, for example, who used to come from a creative and wagering background, but now has transitioned over to competitive and is doing extremely well. So how do we actually take high ground in our fights, in arena, and in actual tournaments? Your mechanics aren't the main factor in this. There are two main contributors here. Your timing and when you go for high ground, and your second is your vertical efficiency. Now let me explain what I mean by these a little bit. Your timing, for example, if someone's already building up, they're already 2 layers above you and you just start trying to ramp up, chances are they're going to hold height pretty easily. But if your timing's good and you wait for them to fall down or come to attack your wall, and as they're going down, you start building up, this is really nice timing to try and grab high ground. But what do I mean by vertical efficiency? Well, what I mean is how fast you are going vertically, so going upwards, in comparison to going horizontally. So let's take an example of double ramping. If you're double ramping, you are still moving upwards, however, you're also moving very horizontally, you're doing 0 jumps at all, which means that you're going up pretty much as slow as you can. Now compare this to something like doing 90s. You're consistently jumping as you go, and obviously your verticality is increasing a lot more. So let's take a situation and show a small mechanical aspect that you can do to increase your verticality, and then this will become a little bit more clear as we go into some further examples throughout the video. So let's take this situation where you're playing defensive and you're boxed up. You see your opponent drop down, so you see this as a perfect opportunity to take high ground. You edit out, then you do 1 Thwifle Cone, and then you keep ramping upwards and then try and do some 90s. At this point, your opponent has consistently kept high ground from you, but why? Well, as you leave, the Thwifle Cone doesn't really get you anywhere. You're still just walking up the ramp at the same speed. You are protecting yourself, but in all honesty, it doesn't actually get you any higher because you're not doing a jump that allows you to go up a layer. So let's take this other example, example B, where you leave the box, you place a ramp, you turn around and instantly do a 180. You've already gotten more vertical height than you would have if you just double ramped or done a Thwifle Cone. You can then continue to 90 from this position, or really do anything to keep you moving upwards. The main point here is try to ensure that you're not walking up just straight ramps as much as possible, as this is the slowest way to actually gain high ground. So let's go in depth with some actual mechanics to learn. The most important part about getting high ground is actually just claiming it early. If a player in the fight has not already just sat and climbed to high ground and spraying down, and it's both players ramping, you should ensure that you do this as early as possible. If you two are on an even playing field, starting to go towards each other, this is where you should start ramping as early as possible. This gives you that very early advantage and you can immediately start spraying down your opponent, and then you are the one who is aggressive. Whoever is on low ground is usually the player who is more defensive, and the player on high ground is the one who is more aggressive. And as we know about Fortnite, the player who is more aggressive wins the majority of the time unless you're a very good defensive fighter. And this is where a huge amount of players struggle, just because they've tried to play way too defensively and they're not good at it. It's critical in every fight that you try to claim the high ground, even if it doesn't look like your opponent's ramping for it, because they can really quickly try to gain that verticality on you, then you have to start playing defensive. A great tip I like to see from Lechy here in the background is actually as he's ramping, he stays on the far right hand side of his ramp. This gives him that right hand peek and actually allows him to see exactly where his opponents are and at which height they're at. This gives him that information to let him know if he has the high ground and he has the advantage, or if the opponent does. Obviously, this doesn't really work if your opponent's climbing to your left. However, at the same time, if you're at the right angle, this is something you really should employ. So that's how to take high ground, but how do you retake high ground if you've lost it? I alluded to this one a little bit earlier, and what you want to do is edit out your wall, place a floor and then a ramp, and then place 2 high walls behind you. This will block your opponent's shots from being able to hit you since they're already above you. Then all you want to do is place another floor and then another ramp. This instantly puts you up another 2 layers from where you were. Most people who set high ground in fights are only 1 or 2 layers above you, so this should either put you above their layer or on equal par with their layer. In particular, if you time this right when they've just dropped down. So how do some of the pros use this? Let's take the first clip of Lechy, where he does this, where he edits out to the side, places the 2 high walls, and then doesn't place the floor or the ramp. Instead, he edits through the wall and gets the elimination on what I presume is World Cup champion Booga. The 2 high walls that Lechy placed potentially blocked any shots that this completely lost opponent would have taken, but I'm not sure that he actually knew how. Then all that you needed to do was edit through and pick up an easy elimination. This next clip is a variation that Mitro uses. You can see that he gets sniped by probably, again, the best player in the world, and his reaction is, well, as you'd expect. Oh my! Once he's boxed up, he sees the opponent on his wall, he edits out, places a ramp, 2 walls, and then also places 2 high walls before placing his ramp. Essentially doing 2 90s, but in a bit of a weird sequence. The 2 high walls, again, block an opponent if they were going for shots, then that ramp afterwards giving those 2 layers of vertical movement. This is an extremely efficient way to do 90s outside your box while being protected. This next variation Mitro uses is purely because the guy is to his left wall. You can see after getting beamed and naturally calling the guy a stream sniper,
this kid is stream sniping.
You can see he edits out the wall, ramps up, and then does 180 with 2 high ramps over the top to block off the opponent. This very left ramp should be over the top of where the other player normally is if he was to go up a layer, so this should have boxed him up. However, the opponent ended up going to the other direction and moving a tile to the left, which ended up getting him a wall to edit through and actually picking up Mitro. However, the mechanics that Mitro used were still spot on. The next building technique that you can use is what I call the double ramp block. If there's any cooler names, let me know because I genuinely can't think of one. So all you need to do is while you're walking up your ramp, you place 2 ramps in front of you, 1 above and 1 to the side, and then simply place a floor and a ramp to catch yourself on and build up on off of there. You can then either do 90s or you can place a floor and ramp to get continuous multiple heights. This is basically an alternative again to what we talked about earlier, where you just don't want to be straight walking up these ramps. This gives you more opportunities to get high ground, and the 2 ramps that you place block your opponent if they get trapped underneath them, giving you that guaranteed high ground. Something to know about this is that you can actually be more efficient with controller movement when you're doing this, because when you place the floor and the ramp, you can actually stay to the back side of this and then do a 90 on this ramp that you've built, rather than the 1 tile ahead of it, like most of the time you have to do on keyboard and mouse. If you've ever watched Tayson's stream, you'll be able to see that he does this a lot. Unfortunately, I can't show you that because he has sub-only mode VODs on and I can't download them, even though I'm subbed. But let's take a look at how some other pros use this. Let's take this first example from Mitro yet again, where he firstly picks up an elimination on opponent and then starts hearing another opponent behind him. So he does a slight variation of this where he double ramps, but then also cones and walls in front of him and does a 90 on the same tile. This is an extremely nice little variation of this because it continues to block off the opponent and potentially box them in the cones and the walls no matter how the opponents approach him. And I don't know why every example that I've used today he has died in, but I can assure you it's nothing to do with this particular building mechanic. Himself and Re also have variations that do of this with just a single ramp rather than double ramping over, which is a little bit more conservative on the materials, but also blocks them from a little less angles. You can see in Reet's example, he places a ramp by looking as far up as possible to get the furthest reach of it and then cones it, then just as a simple floor and ramp to get him up. And we can see in Mitro's example, he does something very similar by coning the top of this ramp, but then instead he places walls all around the side to protect himself from that left hand side as well. If you've ever watched Mitro stream, this is something he does a ton. All of these examples of this are really efficient ways for you to try and gain high ground without your opponent actually being able to get up. Just remember, you're trying to walk up straight ramps as little as possible. Something else that's really important that isn't a mechanical issue is that while you're climbing up, you need to be constantly looking for shots on your opponents. If you're not actually giving yourself opportunities to shoot your opponent while you're going up, your opponent is just going to shoot you back, be this via spraying or just hitting you with a big pump shot. So consistently look for those shots while climbing up. But what do you do if your opponent is a cranker and all he's doing is just sitting multiple layers above you just shooting down? Well, that's where it's time to chop out. All you need to do is really just make sure that you've got yourself protected from other angles, and sometimes your opponents, all they're going to do is just 90, 90, 90 if they're, let's be real, not a very good player and they're kind of scared to fight. They're just going to try and hold that high ground as much as they can, so don't be afraid to try and chop them out as much. A lot of the times when you start to chop them out, they'll hear this and they'll just instantly drop down to try and fight you anyway, and this is your opportunity to take height and then be aggressive in the fight. Don't give them the opportunity to consistently have that high ground. It's really not that complicated. And I can't talk about taking high ground without talking about mobility. Shockwaves and bounce pads are obviously very good utility to take high ground with. Just remember, however, if you're going to shockwave height in a fight, you have to be careful to make sure you don't go too high. If you go too high, your opponent's just going to beam you out of the air and that's going to be the end of you. So you need to make sure you're multiple layers below. Around 4 layers below will put you up to a really good height. And also, if you have a tactical shotgun, you might be best just to consistently spray down with your assault rifle down at the opponent because this will break their floor and mean they won't be able to ADS. Obviously, if you have a charge, hold your charge as you're going. If you're down below and an opponent shockwaves on you up above, you can see them holding their charge. Make sure you get a shot or two in, but then instantly try and block yourself because they are going to hit you with a big shot. Then, if they've built on top of the builds that you have built there, you can easily just edit them out and then just claim that high ground again. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. I've been Reisshub. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Peace!